Greetings. I hope you enjoyed reading the Political Science Quarterly article. I do believe that of the three articles that I published with my mentor, I believe that that one was the best. And I like it because it has elements of comparative politics in it, studying the weaknesses of the Third Republic, weakening potentially a weakening democracy in Britain, where political leaders gave the people what they wanted instead of what they needed, which was security. And certainly that article did test the conventional notion of alliances as strengthening states. I still do think that alliances usually are an aid to states, and so don't get the idea that I'm opposed to alliances. I just think that you have to also make sure that you're doing what you can to strengthen yourself internally as well. Today I want to turn to the first lecture of several on German history. My father-in-law wrote a book called The Germans, Victims of Geography, and it seems strange, right? Thinking of the Germans as the victims of geography, the victims of history, because most people, when they think about Germany, they think about a menacing country. We think about World War I and World War II, when in reality, for most of German history, uh, Germany was a collection of city-states, of principalities, of duchies. Germany was, in many cases, until the 20th century, the battleground. Think about Napoleon marching through the German states, for example, or when I talked about the 30 Years' War earlier, where that war was fought in German lands. And so there is something to this if you take a longer range view of Germany. So Germany is on a broad, flat plain with only a couple natural borders, as Roskin points out. The population of Germany is about 81 million people. The total fertility rate is quite low. It's only about 1.4. Replacement is 2.06, which means that the population of Germany is very slowly declining. This is a country that has pretty good size. Germany's about the size of Montana, which is our fourth largest state. The slowly declining population has several consequences, only one of which is in your notes. So one of them is that if your population is declining, if your fertility rate is too low internally, one way that you can augment your population, of course, is immigration. You can bring in people from outside to make up a labor shortage. One of the other things that it means is that the age structure of Germany is getting quite old. You have more and more old people who are being supported by fewer and fewer younger people, which means that the tax burden and the tax rate on German workers is increasing because an older population costs more money to maintain. And I think I gave you the statistic earlier, but usually the most money that is spent on health care for an individual, for a typical person, there are obviously lots of exceptions, but typically the most money that's spent on health care is spent in a person's last year of life. So the first overview is that Germany has an aging, one of the oldest age structures in the world, low fertility rate, slowly declining population. The second overview about Germany is that, unlike Britain and France, Germany failed to develop a sustainable democracy before World War II. There was one brief flirtation with democracy, the failed democracy called the Weimar Republic, which I'll talk about later. Germany was just as wealthy as Britain, just as wealthy as France. In fact, Germany in the late 19th century was wealthier than France. And yet, democracy was a failure until the post World War II period. And so an interesting question is, for a country that is wealthy, you may remember I talked earlier about how many people believe that there is an economic prerequisite for a stable democratic society. Certainly, Germany had that economic prerequisite, and yet democracy failed in the pre-World War II era. And in fact, the only democracy that Germany had before World War II produced Adolf Hitler. So the question is, well, why? And there's lots of explanations, and Roskin only talks about one. So I'm going to give you three of them to think about. The first is the ambivalence of democracy and liberal democracy in the 19th century. The economic elites, and by the way, the middle class, both preferred a state-dominated economy. So once again, we're back to that concept of statism that I told you is prevalent throughout Europe, and I illustrated with France, not private enterprise. So first of all, this notion of statism fed into authoritarianism. Second, there was an authoritarian political culture. Germanic peoples adopted what I would call, and I'm stealing from Gabriel Almond, who for many years was considered one of the five most important comparativists, maybe in history. Gabriel Almond came up with this notion of political culture, that people were either participants, like in the United States and Britain. They were subjects, like the Germans in this case, people who were aware that politics was important, aware that the political system impacted their lives, and yet did not want to participate, believed that it was something outside themselves. So politics impacted them, but they weren't particularly interested in impacting the political system. And then the last was the parochial culture, cultures in which people really didn't understand the linkage between politics and their lives. So second's political culture. There was an authoritarian political culture. The third is that unlike Britain and France that unified very, very early, the German nation was divided for most of its history. At one point, what today is Germany was almost 1,800 political entities, 1,790, if you look at your notes, principalities, duchies, and city-states. And even at the turn of the 19th century in 1800, there were still over 300 political entities that today we would call Germany, and that was in those days called the Holy Roman Empire. Germany did not become an independent country. There was not a country that we would call Germany until after the Franco-Prussian War, which occurred in 1870, and we get the pronouncement of a unified and independent Germany in 1871. So certainly this is many centuries after we see a unified state in both Britain and France. So why a lack of democracy, ambivalence of democracy, authoritarian political culture, and a nation divided? We talked about nations and states for years. The German peoples were a nation that did not have a unified state. The third overview is that Germany is a federal state like the United States. As I mentioned early on in the course, federal states are rare. Only about 10% of countries in the world are federal. So in this respect, Germany looks a lot like the United States. Britain, France, they're both unitary systems. Germany and the United States are federal. Your book talks about federalism as being a reaction to the centralized Nazi state and Adolf Hitler, and I think that that is a factor, but I don't think that Roskin is telling you the whole story here. I believe that federalism is tied to both strong regional histories, strong regional identities. And I would agree with Roskin that certainly this is also a reaction to a highly centralized Nazi state that existed from 1933 to 1945. When I ask you on the exam, and certainly this will be a question I will put into the test bank for the final, in my mind, there is no question that the German states are much more powerful than their American counterparts. And I think this is true for multiple reasons, but there is one that I really want you to remember, and that is that they are far more economically independent than American states are. And I don't know why it says that they have far more economic independence than American states do. It should be that American states have. So that's a weird typo in your notes, but that's okay. As I point out in your notes, American states are like addicts, and what they're addicted to is money. The states are dependent on the national government for over $700 billion in transfers from the national government every year. The costliest program is Medicaid on a yearly basis. And notice what's going on right now with this coronavirus pandemic. Notice that the states are very fragile. They don't have a lot of economic independence. And notice that the states are looking to the national government for revenue to try to make their states whole so that the states can reopen and offer services and all of those kinds of things. In Germany, this does not happen. And the reason is that unlike America, where the states have to ask the national government for assistance, in the German Constitution, the German states are guaranteed an equal proportion of tax revenue. So the national government gets 42.5% of revenue. The states get 42.5%, and local governments get 15%. It used to be 40, 40, and 20, and to tell you the truth, I forgot to look up when that was changed, but it certainly was changed. And so the German states are constitutionally guaranteed an equal share of tax revenues. It doesn't stipulate the percentage. Originally, it was 40% each. Now it is 42.5%. The fourth overview is that I believe that Germany is an excellent case study, and I think Japan is another country that is an excellent case study, that a democratic political culture can be learned very successfully, as it did after World War II. We certainly see in Germany how democracies can fail, because we saw Germany's first democracy, the Weimar Republic, disintegrate into dictatorship, and it ushered in one of the most grotesque regimes in world history, the Nazi regime. The fifth overview I kind of started with and gave you a few introductory comments, and here I'll read and I'll make a comment or two. I only have a minute and a half left on this mini lecture, but as I said, my father-in-law was a history professor who wrote a book called The Germans, Victims of Geography. And I think that this is true. For most of German history, this was not a real strong country. There was a battle. Many peoples tried to unify their Germanic peoples. But Roskin points out what my father-in-law did, that the normal conditions for the Germanic states was one of weakness, that Germany was often Europe's battlegrounds, as I mentioned, the 30 Years' War, the Napoleonic Wars. But there have been periods where Germany has been strong, and when so, it is very scary to its neighbors. It potentially becomes the hegemon, or the strongest country in the region. And certainly today, if you take a look at Germany, there is no question that of the countries in Western Europe, Germany is the most imposing in terms of being the economic heavyweight that many argue is the glue that is holding the European Union together. So those are my 5 overviews. We start history in the next mini lecture.